Hello, I'm Tony Anadio, and in this lecture, I'd like to talk about Greek architecture as an exercise of power. Not to be confused with the power of architecture, which is something very different. An exercise of power means to impose or to intimidate, to co-opt, to exclude, to deceive, to impress, to persuade. Things of that nature, rather than just discussing why architecture is so powerful. So what I'd like to do is talk about a few examples generally from the Greeks, and then one specific example from the Greeks. So we think about architecture. Architecture has a lot of different purposes, and there are a lot of things that go into creating architecture. You need ideas, you need materials, you need labor, you need a purpose. But our architecture also can be used for specific purposes. And that's what I'd really like to focus on. So if we look at the Greeks, they tried to understand the world that they lived in by systematically studying it. And one of the things that they kind of focused on was geometry. Of course, architecture is a structure built on some form of geometry. So when we look at geometry, if you remember this from your school days, things like shapes of triangles, rectangles, and so on, they all have particular measurements and relationships. And the Greeks tried to understand how those things worked out in nature itself. So when we look at how different shapes relate to each other, the Greeks began to understand that there were relationships that were more appealing than others. And of course, aesthetics can be a very personal thing. So when we look at what they decided, you can say, well, this appealed to them at this particular time. But once that happens, then other people might say, well, this appeals to me too. And then you have the start of a tradition, rather than something being kind of objectively valid as aesthetic in the universe. So the Greeks, as they understand these relationships, tried to understand them mathematically. And this is a bit tricky because they didn't use the same numbers that we use. They did not use Arabic numerals. So a lot of what they understood were simply relationships of one thing to another. And they began to notice that there were similarities between these relationships in nature and their own bodies. And so there's a lot of scholarly debate about this subject. It's sometimes called the golden mean or the golden ratio. And it is roughly 1 to 1.618. And if you look at your own body, there are a lot of those measurements which come close to that number. So for example, the size of your head to your torso is roughly 1 to 1.618. The size of your hand to your forearm is pretty much the same thing. The size, your height from your head to your the tip of your fingers is roughly 1 to 1.618. So there's this ratio that they understood, but scholars have been debating how much that actually informed their architecture. So rather than debating that, what I'd like to just point out is that the Greeks used geometry in order to build. So what we want to do is to understand when they built their structures is how they went about doing it and what were the purposes. So let's take, for example, Greek theater. So we'll talk about theaters in general. So theaters in ancient Greece were a way to publicly perform literature. And so I'm not going to talk about the specific ideas that they covered, but rather how it functioned as an architectural space. So if you're going to have a performance and you want many people to see the performance, you're somewhat limited by human nature because people can only see so much. So the Greeks understood that if you want more people to see the performance, then it helps to arrange them in a semicircle. So that way, those people can all have some view of the stage. However, what happens to the people behind them? So they had to not only arrange them in semicircles, but they had to figure out a way for more people to actually see it. Now, this is related to the nature of sound as well. If you stand at the bottom of a hill and somebody is standing at the top of a hill and you speak to them, they can hear you pretty clearly because sound is radial. It travels in all directions at once. That's why if I turn around, you may not hear me as well, but you can still hear me. So sound will also follow the path of least resistance. So as it encounters resistance on the hill, it begins to travel up the hill. However, if someone is at the top of the hill, speaking to someone at the bottom of the hill, it's much harder to hear them because sound is radial and it will go out in all directions and there's nothing stopping it. So it's much harder to hear in that direction. So the Greeks understood this. So they knew that if they built seats in a semicircle and then gradually increased their height, then more people can see and hear. Now, building something like that could be a pretty big undertaking, but rather than a big construction project, the Greeks simply found hillsides and they cut the seats into the hillside, which meant a lot less work and served their purposes. So this, in a sense, is having power over nature, to understand how nature works. Sir Francis Bacon had said, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. So they obeyed the principles of nature and they understood these ideas. And so that's how these Greek theaters are constructed. But then if we instead of looking at the specific plays or literature or poetry that they perform there, we can look at what happens to the audience in a play. This is very similar to our modern counterpart, which is a movie or television. So you have this performance, and it's a social setting. The ideas that they tried to get across are very similar to the things we do today. But what happens with an audience is something Aristotle called catharsis. So you'll be watching a play and there'll be this buildup of drama, and then all of a sudden there'll be the climax where there's this outpouring of emotion, this moment in which it all just comes crashing down on you. And following that cathartic moment, you become a better person. And of course, this is experienced collectively by the audience. It's very similar to how people today will watch a particular TV show, and that means they can all talk about it. It sort of bonds them together. They have ideas about plot lines and the characters in the show. So this is no different in ancient Greece. So the Greeks understood these principles, and this is a way that you can look at art as an exercise of power, because it's a way for you to kind of get your message across to the crowd, a way to persuade them or to impress them. And of course, as time goes on, these theaters become much more elaborate. They have different parts. There's the orchestra, where the choir, which is the group of singers, and then the actors. There's this skene, which is this part behind them where you have different characters voicing things or used for settings and things like that. And so the whole space becomes much more architecturally beautiful over time. And sometimes they're even located in very beautiful landscapes where you might have an ocean view or something like that. It's no different than today with the purposes of architecture to try and impress people with its beauty. Now let's look at the Parthenon. So if we think about the Parthenon, it's one of the most famous buildings in history. We first have to understand what's the backstory to the Parthenon. How did it come to be in the first place? And where is it? It's in Athens at a place called the Acropolis. The Acropolis meant the high city. It's this giant rock outcropping which held special meaning for the Athenians and for many ancient peoples. When you have a mountain or something like that, it was often seen as closer to the gods. So the Acropolis is in sort of the center of the city, and it had more or less always had some type of temple on it. When the Greeks fight the Persians in the 5th century BC, the Persians will destroy the temple, and in the aftermath, after the Greeks join together and defeat the Persians, there is this desire to rebuild this temple. But it's important to understand what Athens' position is after the Persian War. So the Greeks had all joined. They're all a bunch of city-states, and we refer to them as the Greeks, but they're a bunch of different city-states, and they didn't really see themselves as one people. We just simply collectively call them that. But in the aftermath of this war, Athens really becomes the dominant city-state. As they fight the Persians, they had organized something known as the Delian League. This was a sort of group of city-states that would contribute either money or soldiers. If you couldn't contribute soldiers, you contributed money to pay soldiers, mercenaries. So after the Persians are defeated, the Greeks realize that they probably should keep the Delian League together in case the Persians come back. It's always a concern. People who lose wars don't like losing wars, and the Persians had already been defeated once by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon, and they came back. So they decide to keep the Delian League together, and of course the money keeps coming into a treasury on the island of Delos. That's where it got its name from. The leader of Athens in the aftermath of the war is a man named Pericles. He's a very shrewd politician, and I won't go into his entire history here, but I'll point out that he makes this, or it's thought that he made this secret peace treaty with the Persians, which meant that the treasury at the island of Delos was not really necessary for defense. Eventually, he will succeed in moving that treasury to Athens, and then he starts spending the money. And one of the things he spends the money on is the Parthenon. So even its background, this is an exercise of power on behalf of Pericles. But if we look at the Parthenon and what it is, what makes it so special, it, like Greek theaters, represents the Greeks' understanding of nature, a sort of power over nature. If you look at the facade, there are 8 columns. Now, if you're going to build a temple and you need to use columns to support the ceiling, you're going to want to make sure that those columns are what we call plumb. You take a plumb line, use a weight at the end of a string, it's perfectly straight, and that's how you can tell if something is perfectly straight. So the Greeks construct, or at least had in the past constructed columns and made them perfectly plumb. And they began to notice something, that they didn't quite look right. They looked like they were a little cockeyed. They didn't really know why, but the reason is because of the way we see. Our eyeballs have lenses which are curved, so we see things that are slightly curved. We also have stereoscopic vision, so what we think we see is really just a combination of what both of our eyes see from a slightly different point in space. And we also see things in perspective. So things that are farther away are smaller. If that wasn't true, then everything would be just about the same size and it would be smeared in front of us and we wouldn't be able to see anything. So the Greeks understood that they needed to make compensations for those optical effects. And so they come up with a series of ideas for these columns. The columns are constructed in drums. So you might have a drum that's about 3 feet in height, this big around or so. And then they would stack them up. They didn't have any mortar. So they would kind of line them up and they would stack them. So what they do is they use something called entasis, which meant that the columns were a little bit fatter at the bottom than at the top. They also use fluting, which if you look at the columns, they have these stripes, kind of like these little cavities carved in them. And those serve a couple of different purposes. On one hand, if you have a perfectly smooth column, it will show up any defect. So if it's slightly not perfect, you will be able to see it. The fluting kind of removed that, and the play of light across them kind of hid those imperfections. But remember, these are drums, and they're stacked on top of each other, so there are horizontal seams, and the fluting also served to hide those seams. There was another aspect of this fluting, though, that the Greeks probably didn't understand, but which greatly added to their strength. If you look at a column, if I take a column and drop it into water, it's going to sink until it hits the earth. So the earth is going to stop it from going any further. So when you stack a column up, the forces of gravity are still pushing down on the column. But because something is stopping it from making it to the center of the earth, then those forces of gravity are then diverted out. So if you have a force that is going out, you want to counter it with a force going in. And when you take one of these drums and turn it this way, what you'll see are all of these basically little arches in them. Now the Greeks didn't understand the physical strength that an arch brought, or the architectural strength that an arch brought, but that is one of the effects. But the other thing that the Greeks do is that they take these columns, and instead of making them perfectly plumb, they tilt them in just a little bit, about 2.6 inches from the bottom to the top. It's really not very perceptible, except that they end up looking straight. And in fact, if the two arches, or the two columns on each end were extended into space, they would finally come together about a mile up. This is similar to what would happen if you were standing in the middle of railroad tracks going off in the distance, and if they go straight into the distance. It looks like they go to a point, as if they come together in the distance, even though you know they don't. But if I wanted to trick your eye and make it seem like those railroad tracks go perfectly straight into the distance, I'd have to bend them out, which means you couldn't use them as railroad tracks. But those sort of tricks that the Greeks used were really revolutionary for their time. But it isn't just the columns. It was pretty much every line on the Parthenon. So for example, there's what's known as the stylobate. This is just the platform on which the columns rest. If you make that perfectly flat, which you would think you would do, it will look like it dips down a little bit. So they actually had to curve it up a bit, about 1.5 inches or so, and then it looks straight. It's the same when you look down the side of the Parthenon. It actually curves in and up. They say that there's not a straight line on the Parthenon, and because of that, it looks straight. So this represented something that the Athenians could do that not every other city-state could do. Okay, so we look at power over nature. That's one thing. But they choose to build the Parthenon on the Acropolis. This is a building that can be seen from every point in the city, and even much farther out from the city, even from the sea. So it's a way to sort of broadcast that Athens, has arrived. So if we look at Pericles' intent here, we want to understand the how and the why. If you look at the political message this sends, if you have a city-state capable of technology that you are not capable of, you're probably not likely to attack them. Sort of like if you have a tribal civilization living in mud huts next to a city with giant skyscrapers, they're probably not thinking they could attack them and win. That technology sends a message, a political message, do not mess with Athens. But this is also a temple. It's a religious space. For the Greeks, they look at their temples a little bit differently than we see modern temples such as churches, synagogues, mosques, etc. They didn't really worship inside them as a group. Most of that worship took place outside. The temples were generally places that housed statues of deities. So, for example, the Parthenon was the house of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. But they would also have places to store votive offerings. It could also be used as a treasury. They'd keep money there and so on. So it was sort of a safekeeping place. But most of the religious activities would actually take place outside, animal sacrifice and things like that. But everybody had to worship there. And this is a way for the Athenians to earn the favor of Athena. This is why Greeks worship their deities. They want the blessings of their gods. So they figured that these temples would be one way to impress their gods. So in that sense, it's a form of religious power, and it was exercised socially because everybody had to worship there. So when we look at these examples, they're more than just something to look at. There's a lot of different ways to look at architecture. You could look at it aesthetically, technologically, or for its purpose. And there are lots of different purposes for architecture. But in this sense, I wanted to just explore what it was like or what it is as an exercise of power. So how does it, intimidate or impose or deceive or co-opt or something like that? That's really one way to kind of consider what the Greeks had actually accomplished.